Welcome. I am Mr. Abbott, and today I'll be talking about basic characterization, looking at concepts for describing the characters in your story, as well as building their personalities. And so today we'll be reviewing multiple concepts, and there's some vocabulary that you should probably know. I'm going to be going over this in a minute. You should know the terms protagonist, antagonist, ancillary character, foil, stereotype, archetype, as well as the ideas of character traits, static versus dynamic characters, flat versus round characters, direct characterization, indirect characterization, and the acronym STEAL. And so let's start going through some of the basic ideas of characterization. One of the most basic terms you're going to want to know is the term that describes the character in the story who the reader is going to relate to and want to see succeed. Oftentimes, you'll think of this as the hero of the story, but a more precise term is what's called the protagonist, because the protagonist is not always a hero. Sometimes the protagonist is the opposite of a hero. But still, even if the protagonist is not a hero, it's still the character that you want to see succeed, even if they're doing things that are wrong. Another term you should know is the opposite of the protagonist, and this is the person or thing or idea who opposes, fights, or hurts the protagonist. And this is what's called the antagonist. Now, sometimes the character is their own antagonist. It could be if they're having an internal conflict that the protagonist is their own antagonist. But usually in most stories, the antagonist is somebody different than the protagonist. And so this is what builds tension in your story. You want to have your protagonist and you want to have someone or something that's working against your protagonist. If you don't have those two things, it's really hard to build interest in a story. Everybody else in the story is going to be what's referred to as an ancillary character or a supporting character. Here I have an image of every character that's shown up in The Simpsons, and they all somehow support the story in some way. But they aren't the protagonist or the antagonist. They usually just kind of hang around with those two characters. And so this is from the Latin helper, and it usually means less important characters who are not the protagonist or antagonist. But they will highlight the traits of these characters and will interact with them to show some kind of meaningful insight into the narrative or the protagonist or antagonist's character. Now, one of the things you want to think about when you're thinking about your characters and other people's characters are what are their character traits? What are those words that would describe their personality? And so here are just some of the R words, right? Are they reliable or rational? Are they resourceful, relaxed, respectful, responsible, responsive, romantic, righteous, reflective, reverential, robust, reputable, reassuring? These are those words that describe how people act, right? And this is what's called the character traits. And so when I'm talking about character traits, I'm talking about these words that describe the way that characters act. Now, one last term that I really want you to understand as far as characters go, this is something that's pretty useful. It's what's called a foil. And so a foil is a character who, through its differences, shows something about another character, right? So if we have this guy here, right, and we say he's tall, just from this picture alone, you can't tell how tall he is, right? There's no frame of reference, and this is where the foil comes in. The foil shows off the character. Now, this character, I can tell how tall he is because I'm putting him next to a character that's not as tall. And you can do this with multiple character traits. If you want to show how brave somebody is, you put them next to a character that's not very brave. If you want to show how kind somebody is, you put them next to a character that's not so kind. This is the term that's used as a foil, and it really kind of can be used to highlight exactly who your character is or is not. Now, not all characters are the same. Sometimes characters stay the same, right? Most of your characters in your story, especially your ancillary characters, are going to be static characters. They stay the same at the beginning of the story as they are at the end of the story. You don't want much change. Whereas dynamic characters, who are usually either your protagonist or your antagonist, they change throughout the story. We see them develop in important ways that really kind of show something about the story, right? And so a static character, when faced with new environments, static character does not change or evolve. They're usually kind of naturally appealing. They don't have to change for the readers to like them. And it's ideal for heroic, charismatic, or quirky characters such as Sherlock Holmes or Tom Sawyer. Dynamic characters undergoes change in response to what's going on in the story. Typically, they might be on the verge of some kind of change when the story starts. They have flaws that make them interesting, and their transformations make them more likable. If you want to start with a dynamic character, don't start with a character that's perfect yet. Start with a character who's imperfect and they reach a more perfect form throughout the story. And dynamic characters tend to be characters who are central to the story, such as the protagonist, as I mentioned earlier. Now, another thing to think of that seems like static and dynamic characters, but is not, is the concept of flat versus round characters. Now, static and dynamic has to do with how characters change. Flat versus round goes to show how deep their personality is, right? So flat characters are usually uncomplicated, they remain the same. They have one or two character traits that define them. Maybe they're, you know, selfish and cruel. That's it. That's their whole personality. There's not much, you can't dig any deeper. You're never going to find anything else besides that from a flat character. They can be summed up in one or two sentences. They're pretty easy to describe. They tend to be static, and they usually don't surprise the reader by doing something unpredictable. So Dory from the first Finding Nemo movie is more of a flat character. She's not very complex. When you get to the Finding Dory movie, you find that she's a little bit more complex than she was in the first movie. Whereas Stitch is what's called a round character, and that's a complex character that undergoes change. It might have different contradictory character traits. So Stitch at the same time was both caring and destructive. He wanted to belong, but he wanted to be by himself as well. This is the hallmark of a round character. Cannot be summed up easily, right? Dory is a forgetful fish. That's a happy, forgetful fish. That's pretty much her whole personality. Stitch is much harder to describe. That makes him a round character. They tend to be dynamic characters as well, and they really will surprise the reader or the viewer of your story. Now, one of the things you really want to avoid in your stories is stereotypes, especially offensive racial stereotypes. Now, this tends to be flat characters, and so what an author will do is, in order to come up with a character, they just kind of use a stereotype off the top of their head, and they end up portraying a group of people in really kind of a negative light. Uh, and so it makes the character immediately identifiable, but it can, it can make it seem like you are less sensitive to the to different audiences, right? Now, there are some stereotypes that are not really offensive, such as the rugged cowboy, the bearded psychiatrist, the scarred villain. Uh, these are usually not, they don't describe actual people in the real world. But oftentimes stereotypes are racial stereotypes, and you really want to avoid those because your writing will come across as being callous. Now, instead of using stereotypes, what's better idea if you want a character to be immediately recognizable in your story is you want to use what's called an archetype. Now, this is a primal or pure personality type that's seen across film and literature for ages, right? They tend to be flat, static characters, and they're just really familiar and recognizable, easy to all human audiences because they show up in a lot of our stories. And so an example of this is we have the 12 different archetypes here. You have the outlaw, the magician, the hero, the lover, the jester, the everyman, the caregiver, the ruler, the creator, the innocent, the sage, and the explorer. And you probably, if you were to think about it, could find examples of these archetypes from the movies, TV shows, and books and other literature that you've read. And so if you want to create a character that's instantly recognizable to your audience and you don't want to put a lot of effort into describing who they are, you're like, I don't have time to describe this character. I just want them to the reader to immediately know who this is, an archetype is really kind of a good idea. And you can see they're pretty prevalent here. Here's a example of different archetypes and how they show up in popular culture. Sorry, the resolution on this is a little bit low, but you can see that they are used over and over again in popular media, right? Now, you could start off with an archetype for your protagonist and move beyond it, show that your character is more than just the sage archetype. They're more than just the creator archetype. That's a way to go with your protagonist, but it's not necessarily needed all the time. Now, we want to talk about characterization. So I talked about those character traits earlier, and there's a couple of ways of showing those character traits in your writing. And so one of the methods that is used is what's called indirect characterization. And that's when a character's character traits are revealed not through the author just telling the audience. So if I was using direct characterization, I might just tell you that a character is lazy and rude, right? They're lazy and rude. But if I was using indirect characterization, I wouldn't tell you that. I would just give you the story of how they yelled at their mother when she asked them to get off the couch and help clean up the kitchen, right? So this character who's swearing at their mom and refusing to help with the chores of the house is showing that they're lazy and rude rather than me telling you that they're lazy and rude, right? And so if you want to determine the characteristics, typically they fall into one of 5 categories: speech, thoughts, effects on others, actions, or looks. If you're using indirect characterization, you're usually using one of those methods to show your character's personality. And so let's take a look at this. So the first one is speech. What do the characters say? Are their words positive or negative? Does the character have an accent? Do they speak formally or informally, right? So here's an example from the story Huckleberry Finn, right? The father of the story says, "I ain't heard nothing about you being rich. You get me that money tomorrow." And so we see here that this character has a really an accent that's associated with being uneducated, like hain't, because ain't in our society has a connotation of being uneducated, whether you agree with that or not. Um, Get is kind of a shortened of get, and so he has a very kind of rural um, accent that would lead you to believe that this character has limited education, but also you get the idea that this character is a little bit rude and self-centered, saying that demanding money from the person that he's talking to. You can also get the idea that this character is aggressive, right? And so we're learning multiple character traits just about what this character is saying. And so let's take a look at this next quote. "If you hold your hand closed, nothing good can come in. The open hand is blessed, for it gives in abundance even as it receives." What kind of character traits could you infer from this character? You might look at the way this character is speaking and say that this seems like an educated character, as they are using pretty much academic English. You could say that this character is wise, as they are giving a lesson that seems to be from experience. And they seem to be kind, as they're promoting the idea of having open hands, of giving, right? Um, and so these are all things that you can take away from speech. And so when your character, you don't need to tell your audience what your character is like. You don't need to say, my character is kind, wise, and educated. Look, they said this. All you need to do is just have them speak, and your audience will start to figure out what your character is like. The next category is thoughts. This is another big one for developing your characters. What do the characters think about? Do the characters' thoughts match their actions or words? If a character is thinking one thing and doing another, that tells you a lot about the character. Does the character reveal all the things they think about? Are they thinking about something but not letting the other people around them know it? And does the character's thoughts show an optimistic or pessimistic outlook? These are all some things that you can think about when looking at thoughts. And so here's an example from the life of pie. When he caught a fish and was trying to survive on the ocean, and he's needs to feed himself, and so he decides that I would break its neck. I wrapped the fish tightly into a blanket. I imagined what it would feel like if I were wrapped in a blanket and someone was trying to break my neck. So think about that for a minute. What do we know about this character based upon these thoughts? So the main thing that jumps out to me is that this character is empathetic, right? They don't just act without thinking of their impact on others. He's actively thinking about what it would be like to be in this fish's place, and that's a hallmark of empathy. This also shows a certain amount of sensitivity, that he's not willing to commit violence, even to survive, without really kind of feeling bad for what he's doing. Another way of looking at things is looking at the effects on others. So, what impact do the characters have on those around them? Does the character lift up or hold down those around them? Is the character considerate of others? And does the character willingly hurt others? These are some things to think about. And so, if we look at this picture, what can we infer about the man below from his effect on the woman? How do you know this? And so you could say that this man is insensitive, right? He's smoking next to somebody which is something that most people find displeasing. He doesn't really seem to be considerate of others. You could say that this is part of his personality based upon his effect on this woman. How about this? This is a quote from Harry Potter. What can we infer about Dudley based upon his effect on Harry, and how do you know this? Dudley's favorite punching bag was Harry, but he couldn't often catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was very fast. And so here we can infer that Dudley is aggressive. He's a bit of a bully. He doesn't have much sensitivity or empathy towards others. He seems to have no problem hurting other people. And Harry is learning to adapt, because it doesn't seem like Dudley can be reasoned with. So Harry has just gotten faster and he's able to move and get out of Dudley's way. And so we see here that Dudley's being portrayed very negatively. He has multiple negative characteristics based on what we see here. You might also look at a character's actions. Are they active or inactive? Are they helpful or hurtful? Does the character act bravely or cowardly? What is it that they're doing, and what does that say about that character? And so, if we look at this picture, what can you infer about the man on top of the hill from his actions towards the other man, and how do you know this? And so, you might say the man on top of the hill is helpful. You may say that he's considerate. You could say that he's a team player. He's considerate of those around him because he's reaching his hand out to help somebody else out of safety. He's concerned of the safety of somebody else, wants to make sure they're all right. So he's using his position to help those below him, right? Now, let's look at this quote from the Odyssey. And what can we infer about Odysseus based upon his actions towards Antinous? How do you know this? So here we go. He, Odysseus, drew to his fist the cruel head of an arrow for Antinous. Just as the young man leaned to lift his beautiful drinking cup, Odysseus's arrow hit him under the chin and punched up to the feathers through his throat. So, what can you infer about Odysseus based upon his actions towards Antinous? So, one of the things you might consider is that Odysseus is aggressive, he's violent, he is determined to get his way, even if it means violence. He is ruthless when he kills. And then finally, the last thing you may think about when determining a character's personality are their looks. What does the character look like? Are they neat or sloppy? Are they ugly or attractive? Do they have unique characteristics that make them different from somebody else? And here you have two different characters, very different appearances. And immediately, we're pretty good at gathering people's personality types and getting an idea of who they are based upon their looks. Um, Especially you guys as teenagers are like pros at judging people based upon their looks, right? You're always right, huh? And so let's take a look at how this shows up. So this woman in this picture, what can we infer about her from her looks? And how do you know this? And so you might say that this woman looks grumpy. She looks tired. She looks stressed out. You can see that she's frazzled. She has a stain on her shirt. Her hair looks a little bit messed up. The expression on her face is showing slight anger or irritation. And so we learn a little bit about, not so much about this woman's overall personality, but her current state. Her current state seems very disruptive, right? Just based upon her clothing, hair, facial expression, posture. These are all things that can give you an idea. And so let's try this with actual text. What can we infer about the woman in the story based upon her looks, and how do you know this? The red, swollen face of the woman appeared. She had a halo of red hair floating over a delicate ivory face, the face of a doll, with freckles on her nose. Her smudged eye makeup made her look unreal to me, like a mannequin seen through a warped store window. So, what can we infer about this character? And so, if we look at some of the details here, we have a red, swollen face. And so, a red, swollen face tends to happen when people are crying. So this woman's crying, so she's maybe sensitive. She had a halo of red hair. Anytime somebody mentions a halo, you instantly think angel. So you'd think there's something innocent or holy about this person, right? Floating over a delicate ivory face, the face of a doll, right? And so she's being compared to a delicate ivory face of a doll. So we learn that somehow this woman seems fragile, right? She seems delicate in a way, with freckles on her nose. Her smudged eye makeup made her look unreal to me, like a mannequin seen through a warped store window. And so we're also getting the idea, based on this character's looks, that there's something slightly off about this character. She's somehow warped, right, or unreal. So this character is going to be somehow weird in a way, right? Delicate, sensitive, but also unreal. And so let's review some of the things that we went over. Some of the important vocabulary that you should know by now are protagonist, antagonist, ancillary character, foil, stereotype, and archetype. If you remember what those words mean, congratulations. If you don't, you may want to rewind the video and review some of those concepts. Other important ideas that you should know are character traits, static versus dynamic characters, flat versus round characters, direct characterization, and indirect characterization, especially the acronym STEAL. If you don't remember what the acronym STEAL means, I would strongly recommend going back and reviewing it until you have those letters memorized, because they will help you both in your writing and your character analysis of other characters. So let's move on to building our own characters. Let's watch a little bit more of a video on the building the character assignment. All right, let's look at our assignment related to characterization. And so characters are really going to be the lifeblood of your story. They are going to be the thing that's going to keep a reader interested in what it is you're saying. If you have a character that the reader relates to and wants to see succeed, you're going to be much more successful in keeping that reader's attention and making them interested in your story. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working on adding character detail to your writing. And you're going to write a mini narrative. It shouldn't be more like about a page, designed to highlight the character traits of one character. You're just working on building one character. Choose 5 character traits from the list that I've provided below. And then I want you to theorize how you can show these character traits in your narrative. I want you to think about STEAL: speech, thoughts, effects on others, actions, looks. How can you use this to show this character in your story? Now, this does not need to be a complete story. It doesn't need to have a middle, beginning, or end. All I want to see is you develop one character. You want to finally end with highlighting explicitly where you put these examples in your story. So below here, I gave you a list of character traits. If you can't think of what character traits to put in your character, here's a list, and you can look at some of the character traits you can think of. I grabbed 5 off of this list, and I brainstormed, what character traits do I want to show for my character? And so I wanted to build a kind of negative character. So I said they were sluggish, shy, selfish, anxious, but also fair. Actually, I should have changed that, uninterested, but let's change that now. Because I ended up changing this character throughout my story because I originally thought I wanted to do fair, but then as my story was developing, I was like, you know what? I don't think I can really fit this into the size of story that I wanted. So I ended up changing it to another character trait that I was already writing in the story. And this might be something that happens to you. You start off with 5 character traits, but then you're like, that's not really who I'm writing. Let me change one of the character traits to match the character I'm actually writing, right? And so after you come up with those list of traits, you want to tell how are you going to show this? And so if my character is sluggish, how am I going to show it? Well, I'm going to show that he moves slowly. Whenever he moves, he's going to move slowly. And what aspect of steel is this? Well, that's looks, right? That's how he looks. You could say it's actions also, but I'm trying to shoehorn it into looks. I also said that this character is shy. And so people think this character is rude, right? Because he's shy. And so this is effect on others. Selfish, the character repeatedly thinks about himself. That's thoughts. Anxious, the character frets and mumbles while speaking. That's speech. And also worries about a game, right? And that's thoughts. And he's uninterested. He doesn't look around much. And so I said that's actions, right? And so down here, I wrote my narrative. You can read it when you look at the assignment. I'm not going to read you the whole thing right now. But you can see that I've highlighted multiple parts of it. And so these highlights relate to these various things. So when I'm using steel to describe my character, speech, thoughts, actions, looks, effects on others, whenever I write something that is helping to build these characteristics in my character, I highlighted it in this story in order to show, look, this is where I'm building this character. And I want you to do this because I want you to make sure that you're actually putting those details into your story. And so if you scroll down to the bottom of the assignment, what you're going to find is I've given you space to write your own mini narrative. I want you to go through the same process. Think of what character traits do you want to show for this character? And then think about how am I going to show these in an indirect way? Don't just tell me that your character is these 5 things. Show me that they're the 5 things. Show me through their speech. Show me through their thoughts. Show me through their effects on others, through their actions, and through their looks. Okay? And I'm going to check to make sure you've done this because I want to see that you've highlighted it in your mini narrative. And so if you go back to highlight it and you can't find it, it might be because you don't have it. So you might need to write more in your story. And so once again, you're going to be writing a short story. It doesn't have to be a complete story. You can just end whenever you think you've done enough character development. And I want you to highlight that one particular character. Just work on building one character in your story. And so this will be easiest if you're building one character, at most 2 if you want to use a foil, but that's not necessary. So good luck on this practice, and I look forward to seeing what you wrote. Please, as always, contact me if you have questions about the assignment. Otherwise, good luck.